burnout tutorial, I'm going to do an oil change in a 2015 V8 Dodge Challenger. And you can follow these instructions if you have any of the new model Dodge Challenger. So from about 2010 to about 2021, you can just follow along this video. It'll show you pretty much the same to do. And that'll be very similar whether you have a V6 engine or a V8 engine. The only difference at that point would be make sure you're paying attention to your oil filter and the oil type that needs to go into your car, because those are much different for the V8s compared to the V6s. This one here is a 6.4 liter V8, and so that's the one I'm specifically working on. And once again, this is a 2015 model. So just follow along if you have a different year and you'll be fine. But let's get to the video. The first thing that you're gonna do with pretty much any oil change is just loosen the oil cap up top. That'll allow the oil to drain much faster and better once you have the car up and you've loosened that drain plug to let the oil come out. If your oil cap is super tight, then chances are your engine's already hot or it's just put on extra tight. And if you're like me and don't really want to scuff that oil cap, you can actually take a rag and put it in between the pliers like this so that you don't damage the cap as hard. However, it still allows you to loosen it up. Just like that. You can hear it crack and come loose. The next step from here would be get your car up so that you can get underneath to get to that oil drain plug and the oil filter eventually as well. If you have a lowered car, chances are you'll either need a low profile jack or you'll need ramps, gradual ramps, or something like a lift. Thankfully, we have a lift to lift the car up today. But like I said, if that wasn't the case, I would use shallow ramps or a low profile jack to get the car off the ground just enough so you can get under it and loosen that oil plug. If you have a lift, you might know what this is, but this is pretty much just an extra support so that God forbid something fails with the lift and the securities of the lift and the car falls. This is strong enough where it will just bounce off this. So if you're standing near this, you essentially won't get hit by the car, or you'll have enough time to jump out of the way because it will hit here and fall down. So I'm essentially just adding as an extra support. Most lifts, you typically don't need something like this, but just for added security, so I'm not risking my life, and I don't really trust this lift 100%, so might as well put this up with a super heavy car. Another important thing to note is if you just drove your car and you're doing this yourself, that oil is gonna be really hot. So when you loosen that drain plug, you don't wanna get actually scalded and burned by that oil. So it's good to give it a couple minutes. And by that, I mean probably about 15 to 20 minutes would be a good time to let it at least cool down. And my engine, where it's a big engine, it gets really hot. If you can, give it at least a half an hour, maybe an hour's worth of time, and you won't even have to think about burning your hands with the oil. However, because I just drove the car here, it is super hot. So taking my time to set up is no big deal because I don't want to get burned when I loosen that drain plug. If you have a car that's been sitting, I actually recommend the opposite. You should run the car and idle it, simply because that will get the oil through the system again and allow it to drain out a little bit better from all the places that the oil actually sits. However, once again, once you do that, wait for it to cool down at least a little bit so that once again, you don't burn yourself. Once this is up, I think we're good to go as far as loosening that drain plug, finding the oil filter, and trying to loosen that as well. With the Challengers, if you have a guard underneath your car, like this plastic one here, that's probably gonna be best to just take off. And normally that's just 10mm bolts all around, and it's pretty easy as far as where it goes and how it goes back in, but just keep track of the bolts for that spot. Just a key tech tip when you're doing stuff like this is when you pull bolts out to a certain section, I always like to make sure that they're all the same size. And if they're not, then which one the small or large one goes into. Obviously I have a little water in there, but these are all the same size, so obviously I can kind of just put them back randomly. So this is pretty much where you want to look. Once again, if you have a pan here, that's great, just take off the pan. If you don't, then you're looking for this part, which is the oil pan, and this is the drain plug right there. Conveniently, Dodge also helped us out and put the filter right next to it. So you actually don't have to go far for that either. This size is typically either a 13 or 14mm. And I actually know a trick where if you can't get enough leverage to loosen this, most of the time you won't be able to, you can actually attach a second wrench on the end for leverage. And you just do that by taking the circle end, attaching it like that. And then if you pull down, which would be loosened, that's how you get the extra leverage. And this is just once again with a different size wrench on the end of the 13mm. All I did there was I just gave it a couple tugs until what I would call it cracked open. It's almost free spinning there. See how I can turn it a little bit with my fingers, and that just means that it's loose and you don't have to struggle to get it loose anymore, and you can just use your fingers from here. At this point, you're gonna wanna get an oil drain pan. Typically, they're a shallow pan if you're working on the ground, and usually the black colored pans actually signify oil, and then any other color, which is normally green or yellow or something like that, that's actually used for transmission fluid, coolant, or all other fluids. And those kind of are separated. Really, if you just have any pan, you can use that. I sometimes use Bunsen burner pans that are laying around my house. In this case, I have an oil drain setup, and so I'm just going to loosen this by hand until the oil shoots out. Once again, if you haven't let your oil cool down, this is where you can get burned, so just be careful. And the higher you can go loosening this bolt, the less oil you'll have drip down your arm. So that'll help too. It also helps when you keep pressure towards the engine as you're loosening. So that means that the oil doesn't just come spewing out right away. If you're lucky enough, you can understand where the end of the threads are. You can just pull it off right after. Sometimes there's a little gasket. It might be copper, brass, or some other material, and you don't want to lose that either. And so once again, when you take it off, just make sure you don't drop the gasket into the pan and lose that, because you might need it for the new or to plug, you might need it to plug it in after. So this is important to know as well. When your engine oil is black like this, that normally means that it needs to be changed, or it's well overdue for an oil change. So the darker color the oil, that means it needs to be changed. And when you put the new oil in, you'll notice it's kind of like a light brown. However, this one's definitely darker. You can see it's light in some places, but for the most part, it's dark enough where you know it definitely needs to be changed at this point. And that's important to know when you're checking your dipstick up by the engine as well, because that'll give you a good judgment as far as, do I need an oil change now or can I wait? At this point, you just let that drain for a little while and try and get the oil filter, which is right next to it, loose as well. Sometimes you have oil filter wrenches, which are specific for your vehicle and your oil filter. And there are universal ones, plenty of those that you can get in on there. Sometimes it's tough though. So a few things I recommend is definitely try oil filter wrenches first. That's typically the best way to go. However, if you can't get that and you can't turn it by hand, the next best thing would be hit a screwdriver into the end of it on the side, and then you're actually able to turn that screwdriver. If you kind of know what you're doing, then you won't damage the threads on the actual engine part of where it screws on. However, those are a few tech tips I've learned over the years of doing oil changes. It's a pain in the neck getting some of these off, especially when they're in tight spaces. Luckily, this one isn't that bad, so I'm gonna try a filter wrench first. So I wasn't able to get an oil filter wrench on here. However, it actually is loose enough where I can just get it with both of my hands on it. So I'm gonna loosen it by hand. Key thing to remember is this is actually filled with oil. Even if your oil filter is tilted sideways, which may not happen on a Dodge Challenger, but maybe on a different car, even if it's sideways, it's still gonna have a good amount of oil in it. So once you get it off, you're gonna wanna tip it right into the pan that you're using. This is actually how it should be when you take them off. Sometimes they're way too hard to get off. The filter is obviously not off yet. However, there's still oil left in the engine in this specific spot, and that's what's dripping around the side at the moment. So I'm gonna let that drain a little bit, and then I'll loosen it the rest of the way. Two things that you should do when you're putting the new filter back in the car. Always write the mileage and the date on the back of the filter, whatever side you can see. So for this case, it would be the bottom. I put the mileage because you never know if you sell the car or something like that. Whoever changes it next, they can know how long ago that filter was previously changed. Some people also recommend that you change your oil filter every other oil change and not every oil change. With this car, because I care about it so much, I'm gonna do every oil change. However, a lot of people do that. On top of that, you wanna put the date, because on the last oil filter, I don't know if you noticed, but the date was October 30th, 2021, which is over 8 months ago now. But that doesn't really matter because I knew the mileage I had driven was not that much. However, I'd also throw the date on there so that whoever's changing it next can know that. And my final thing would be take a little bit of oil, even if it's what's dripping, and you wanna take it and rub it around this rubber ring. So I'll do that right now. Take a little bit of that oil on your finger, and you wanna rub it, like I said, just around this rubber ring. That'll get it a little bit more secure and get it into the tighter spot, easier to turn rather than just the bare rubber against your inside of your oil filter spot. So that's just a little tip, it'll make it easier to put in. Once you have most of the oil drained, typically the pan actually drains longer than the oil filter spot. So I'm gonna put the filter in before I put the plug back in. But once it's pretty much good and stopped, you can start putting stuff back in. At this point, hand tight is good for an oil filter. So I just screwed it on just by spinning it up. However, you can see that I can still tighten it by one hand. Once I get that to a point where I really can't turn it much with one hand, I'll take two hands, get maybe a 16th of a turn roughly, maybe a 32nd of a turn, and that's good. You really don't need to over tighten these. That's when you start to either strip the inside or it's really just too tight for the filter. It's a piece of crap Scion that went by. Lastly, I'm going to just clean the surface really quick and then start to thread this drain plug back on. When you're tightening this plug, it's good to go just about tight like that. Don't put too much strength into it. And then I double up the wrenches like I did when I took it off and just go a little bit. And once again, that's something you don't want to over tighten, but it's okay to not be your full strength of tightened. So once again, I'm just gonna do a couple pumps like that, not too much. The ends of these bolts are these clips right here, which feel loose. However, that is how it's supposed to be held in. So you want to stick it through the hole in the plastic bottom and then line it up perfectly with that clip, just like that. At this point, just grab your 10mm ratchet and socket and tighten those up. These don't have to be anywhere close to as tight as the oil drain plug. That's all for the bottom part of the car, so you're good to lower the car from here. So if you're doing a full synthetic oil change, which for most people, they do that around every 6,000 miles, that's actually a perfect opportunity to rotate your tires. So check the air pressure, rotate your tires at that point. It's honestly the best time to do it all around, especially if your car's on jack stands or on a lift. I would just do that now. And then once you're good to go, you're pretty much lowering it down and adding oil again. I have 0 weight 40. Once again, this is gonna differ if your Dodge Challenger is either a different engine size or a V6. So just kind of look it up or just look in the manual. That's the best route to go. Mine takes 7 quarts for the 6.4 liter. That's all for this Burnout Extra. Once again, you can do this with any newer year Dodge Challenger. If you'd like to see more of this car, leave comments down in the comments section that tell you what you want to see. I'd love to have this in a few more videos. Obviously, this is not as much of a burnout car as we like to have on the channel, but it is pretty cool and you'll definitely see it in a future video of Burnout. Feel free to like the video, subscribe, click the notification bell, and stay tuned for more awesome videos in this 2015 Dodge Challenger RT Scat Pack lime green with a pretty rad 6.4 liter V8.